The newest professors at BYU. Dan Belnaps is Associate Professor of Ancient Scripture for BYU's Religious Education. Recently received his PhD from the University of Chicago in Northwest Semitics, I believe, where he focused a great deal of his attention on the theories of ritual in its ancient context. His paper is entitled, "Whence is that goodly fragrance, the manipulation of scent in the ancient Israelite temple system?" So please welcome Dan Belnaps.
First of all, I'd like to thank the committee and SANE for giving me the opportunity to present this. It's kind of a work in progress, so you will be the test audience for it and the material in it. The topic really arose from a verse out of the Book of Mormon, believe it or not, that had nothing to do with this, but it had to deal with the destruction of Ammonihah, in which, as Ammonihah is destroyed, the text goes on to say, "And the smell was so great thereof, that it became known as the desolation of Nehors and was uninhabited for years after that." The fact that they brought up smell somehow suggested that in the worldview, I think, of ancient cultures, or at least older cultures, smell played a much greater role in the way they interacted in the world than we tend to use it today, though I think it might just simply because we're less aware of it. The sense such as sight and hearing are the predominant forms. Much of our language and for describing our worldview is couched in that manner. And they got me thinking, how did scent get incorporated into ancient Israel's temple system? We know that there are certain places where it was done, and since ritual is often a process by which you changed an environment to bring about a certain type of reaction, I got thinking that perhaps they used scent in a way, it manipulated the way in which you engaged in scent to bring about certain, perhaps theological implications or even transformation in the way that you relate to your deity. And so that's kind of where the topic arose from, the idea that ritual creates an environment by which you are transformed and be able to interact in ways that you weren't able to before. So with that, there were three primary ways in which scent was manipulated in the temple, ancient Israel's temple, which impacted these things. The first one had to do with sacrifices. Now, I put up here, I used a model here of the tabernacle just to kind of give you a scale of what's going on and to help you understand what must have been involved with sacrifice. I mean, we often think about it in terms of its visual form, what they lifted up, and these different things. But smell would have just been permeated this entire event. If you read Leviticus, the primary text by which you find about how you do these things, you know that the individual who brought the animal to the temple was the one that was expected to slaughter an animal, slaughter it, and then dress the animal, and then the priest would take it and do certain things with it. I don't know how many of you have actually slaughtered an animal. To do research for this, I talked to slaughterhouses, I talked to hunters, people who dress the animals, and got a sense of what you have to deal with when you end up slaughtering an animal, and in terms of smell, what's incorporated there. So I've got the odors associated with sacrifice here. Now, this can get a little graphic, and I could probably even get more graphic than some of these things. But first of all, when you've got the animal that close, for those of you who lived on a farm or worked in a barn, you know full well there are certain smells that come with the animal's natural hide and hair and the oils that are associated with that. When you are sacrificing the animal, you are in close proximity, obviously, to that animal. I mean, you're standing right next to the animal. You're the one pulling the knife across the throat. So the smells of this animal are going to be right there. I mean, the proximity between you and the animal is going to be such that you're right there next to the animal. And so some of this stuff, the smell of the barn and the smell of these things, this is going to come into play. The blood. Now, we might not think much about this, the scent of blood, but that would have certainly been there, especially as you've slit the neck and you're draining the carcass of this blood. It's going to be rich there. According to some people I've talked to, not only is there the smell of the blood, the heavy iron, rich smell of the blood, but the air even can get more humid. Depending on the size of the animal, the immediate humidity of the area as the blood fills this area, this is going to be the scent you're going to be surrounded with. So you got the smell of the animal, the smell of the blood. Going along with the blood, later on in the sacrificial ritual, you are going to take that blood and you're going to do certain things with it. Now, in the case of a sin offering, you're going to take at least part of that blood and smear it on the horns of the altar that you can see on the altar there. But for the peace offering and for the burnt offering, you collect the blood and you pour it at the base of the altar. I don't know if you saw this. Well, let's come back here. Let's see if we can go back. If you go back here and just look at that altar, let's say you've got, the burnt offerings. You offer those 2 times a day. We have no idea, in the case of the tabernacle, if there was any dressing or flooring underneath the tabernacle itself, and if it was just dirt. Can you imagine what it must have been like after day after day after day of pouring out the blood of an animal into the ground? How long does it take for blood to go sour? Are you going to smell that? Is that going to start permeating this area? As we move forward, right? Just to give you an example of what this must have been like, according to 1 Kings chapter 8, you've got the description of what happened during the dedication of Solomon's temple, in which, according to the text, 20,000 oxen were slaughtered, 120,000 head of sheep. Now, maybe that's exaggeration. I'm certainly fine with that. But what it suggests is there certainly were a lot of animals. That's a lot of blood. What are you doing with all the blood? According to the rituals, you're pouring most of that blood at the base of the altar, since most of that was burned in peace offerings, not sin offerings. That's going to stink. It's going to stink quickly, especially as you enter into the hot, dry months of Israel, and this stuff putrefies quicker. Then you got the blood that's smeared on the horns of the altar. Now, that probably didn't stink as much. You're not putting as much blood on there, and yet, just to kind of show you what's going on here. Of course, there's the entrails, okay? If you've ever worked with those, for the most part, they're self-contained, and you're probably going to be okay unless you happen to puncture the gut sac, in which case the smell of all the refuse and the excrement, all of that's going to come into play. This is messy stuff. It's going to stink. And even if you don't, you still got the flesh itself. Now, raw flesh doesn't necessarily have that strong of a smell, but if it starts to go bad, it's going to smell quickly. And then you have the fat. The fat does smell. Fat retains the smells of the environment from the animal around it. This is the most, if you're going to put it this way, smelliest part of the animal. It's going to stink. Now, you offer the fat up to God on the altar, or at least part of the fat. This whole scenario, it's all going to stink. And then you've got Leviticus 1 that would suggest, at least for the burnt offering, once you've slaughtered the animal, and then you've dressed the animal, so your hands are covered, just imagine the visceral sense of this, the blood and the fat, how everything's going to be slick and sticky, and all of that goes with it. Then you're to take these and wash them in the lavers. Wash them in the lavers. I'd be curious to know how often they change that water. Okay? Because if you're not changing it all the time, that water is going to go rancid quickly. So what you end up having over the sacrificial system is a very dirty, smelly, and foul-smelling process. And yet, well, I can come to this slide here a little bit later. One of the things that I find interesting is we often talk about the Hinnom Valley as the place of hell because of this is where you slaughtered different things and you had the idol worship of Tophet. But you've got the same thing with the Kidron Valley in a couple places. This is where you burned the idols from the temple. This is where impurities from the temple went. And then you got this reference from Jeremiah, which suggests in the whole valley of the dead bodies and the ashes and all the fields under the brook Kidron, suggesting that the Kidron Valley was as much a refuse pit as the Hinnom Valley was. And that at least it could also be used as a representation of hell, for lack of a better description. And the reason I bring that up is when you read early Christian descriptions of hell, not only do you get the fire and all the other things we associated with it, but you get a smell. The smell is of putrefying bodies, dissected bodies, serpents and animals cut up into pieces, rivers of excrement that you're doused in. These are the exact types of smells that you might have been smelling when you slaughtered the animal and would have certainly showed up in the area outside of the temple, but immediately to the east, the Kidron Valley. So you might have this connection already between these smells and death, decay, and mortality. Yet what you did then was take those animals, once you've cut them up and dressed them and dealt with those smells, and you burnt them upon the altar, upon which point the smell changed. In all of the offerings that you make on the altar, in Leviticus, it has attached these clauses, an offering made by fire of a sweet savor unto the Lord. You have changed the smell. Now, you've changed a lot of things, but you've changed certainly the smell. You've gone from the smell of slaughter and death and decay to this sweet savor unto the Lord. The burning has transformed the odor. So we already begin to see that there's a transition as we move through the temple, as we go through the temple, and we'll see this as we move closer to